Alright guys, so what I'm gonna do here real quick is kind of show you how to kind of understand the entire flow from where you hit a button in the assignment page and how it does that query and how it sends the data back. So the first thing is we're gonna assume that we just did a fresh clone of the repository or a git pull. Then we opened it up in VS Code, and so uh, it should be in like CSE3330 project. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to activate our virtual environment. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the project 2 directory, and then from here I will um, activate that environment. And you do that by calling the um, activate script. Okay, and so it is now activated. We can tell that it is activated by the fact that our shell now has a env at the very end, beginning of it. So now we know it's activated. Now we need to go ahead and set some environment variables. So we need to set Flask app and Flask environment. So Flask app, I'm pretty sure what that is doing is kind of pointing at the directory that is going to contain the files for our Flask app. So there's some other things in here. So there's like phase 2, that was our phase 2 part of the project. There's instance, this is being used to hold our database stuff. Then there's Flask R, which is what we're actually using for all of our files for the Flask app. So that's what I believe Flask app is talking about. So go ahead and hit enter after typing that out. Then we need to do the environment. So we won't really make use of of Flask environment. It's kind of for if you were going to make a professional piece of code. So you'd have like a development environment, a staging environment, and a production environment. Uh, this is just what the tutorial told us to do, so I'm following it because it won't run without that. So go ahead and set the environment to development, hit enter, and then so because this is our first time running the program, we need to initialize the database to do that. So to do that, what we would do is we would hit Flask. I think it is Flask initdb. Okay, ran, and you get a little console log output here that the database is initialized. Otherwise, you would have probably had some errors. And to really make sure that it's initialized, you can see in this instance directory a flaskr.sqlite, and we can browse this database file as if it was like a regular .db file. So this is database browser for SQLite. It's really simple, free, and easy to use. So if we can go ahead and open a database, if we go to where this is, project 2 instance flaskr.sqlite. Alright, cool. So we have our customers table, our rates table, rentals, vehicles, etc. And we can view our data. So browse it. We have all that good data that we had from the phase 2 files. If you want to understand what's happening in there, you can go to db.py. And so there's some functions in here of what's happening. The main one that you would be looking at would be a init database, to where they get the database object, we create a cursor, we do our schema file, which is it just opens up a .sql file and runs it. So that's just our create tables, drop tables, and then we do the same thing that we did in phase 2, where we open all those .csv files and add them to the database. So it's kind of the same thing. Had to change it up a little bit, just because of the way things worked in this application instead of just a pure SQLite. So after you have ran a init database or initdb, you can now actually run the application. So you just do that by Flask run. And so once you get to this point, you will see that it's just running on this IP address. So we can go to this. And so here we go. We know it's working because it just says home. We probably won't end up actually using a home directory just because of time limits. So the actual URL we're going to go to is the same base URL, assignment. Okay, so this takes us to the assignment page. So right now there's just 2 example queries sitting in here, and whenever you hit a query, it'll run it on the back end and then spit the results out into a table on the page. So hit example query 1, and I believe this is the one where we grab all of the vehicles, and we name the types and the categories based off their number. So it's like the case 1 is equal to truck, blah 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 blah. And so this whole table will load up. Yeah, and then or the columns as well, or the column identifiers, headers. And so the the example query 2 is basically the same thing. It does the same process that this one does, but it grabs all of the customer information. So you have customer ID, name, phone, all that stuff. And so what's really nice about this is you can just send this. You can send this info to a function I made, and it'll just make the table all nice and pretty. All right, so let's start to where these buttons are. So if we reload this page, get rid of this table. So these buttons are located in the templates, assignments, index.html. So this is that HTML file. Here, can I increase the size? There we go. Okay. So that looks a little bit better. So our HTML file is super simple. We just have the body, we have a header, which is this assignment, and then we have our buttons, and we have a table that is empty until we hit one of these queries. So here's our example query 1 button. So this directly maps to this. If you really want to make sure, you could right-click this button here and inspect it. And you can see that button ID is equal to example query 1, example query 1, same stuff. Okay, so now what is happening whenever I click this? So here, if you scroll down, you'll see this script tag that is equal to JavaScript, and that is a JavaScript script, embedded JavaScript, or inline JavaScript. I don't know the exact term. And so what we're doing is we're using jQuery to attach a callback to whenever the button is clicked. So this is what is selecting the button. So it says, okay, whatever HTML element with an ID of example query 1. So we're grabbing this button of example query 1. So the hashtag in the front here stands for ID. Whenever it is clicked, do this function. And what the function is doing is it makes an API, it makes a web request or an API call for an assignment in our backend. So everything is kind of named the same just to keep it all together. And so we click on the button, and then it makes a request for the URL attached to assignment.exampleQuery1, and the data type that we are expecting it to return is JSON. And on a success of the web request, we're going to define our columns for our select statement, and then we're going to send it back. We're going to create the table with the response, which is the rows, and the columns. And so response is going to be, it's going to be all this data. That's what's getting returned. And then columns you have to define yourself, and it will give you, if you pass that into that function, it'll add this to the top. Okay, so let's go look at the back end of what it is actually calling. So that's going to be an assignment.py. So that was example query 1. So here is example query 1. So if bp.route, that stands for blueprint. You don't really have to worry about that. We're calling assignment and then example query 1. And it is a GET request. That also doesn't really matter for this particular use case. And so what this example query 1 function does is it returns the result from this select query. So select query is a function that you just pass the query itself, just like how we were doing it in the phase 2 of the project. So here we have select vehicle ID as VIN, description year, and then the 2 cases from the vehicles table. And so it'll run that query on the database and send back the results as a JSON object. We can look at exactly what it's doing. So here we made that network request, and we can look at this response. It's really ugly because it's on one line, but you kind of get the gist that it's an array of arrays, all of this information. So that's how it works. Is you create the button, name it your query, you create the callback for it through jQuery and Ajax, and then you have a function that also does it. So in this case, it'll call this web URL. You put the query that you are wanting to run, and it will return the results for that. So what happens what if there's an error? Okay, if there's an error, let's force an error. So let's see, what do we have here? GetDB. Let's say getDB.print. It's not a real function, so it's going to error out. So it's going to restart. Okay. So example query 1 should error out now. Alright, so it tells us there's an internal server error. We don't know more than that on the front end. But if you come back to the VS Code, it'll tell you the error in the console. And what's cool is that the application is still running. You don't have to restart it or anything. So it says function object has no attribute print. Let's talk about this. All right, cool. So let's make let's make another example query real quick. So let's start with the button. So we're just going to make a new button. Copy and paste this one. Call it example query 3. Make sure we rename the ID to example query 3. Okay. Let's see. So we're going to do the jQuery selector. Example query 3 dot on. Click. We'll do this function. E stands for the event. It's kind of the click event. So it's kind of a JavaScript thing. It's good practice to include this and always have e.preventDefault because they have a default function that will run whenever this happens. So we have this callback. How do we know it's actually hitting? So for now, let's just do a console.log hit example 3. Okay, so we've resaved it. Just reload this real quick. And we'll go to our console, hit example 3. Alright, cool, works. And it tells you where in that file this is coming from also. Okay, so we know that this callback is working, and this click event handler. So now we need to do our Ajax call. So $sign stands for jQuery, it's just a short and abbreviated version, and then Ajax, which is a like a library to handle web requests. And so you have to put the brackets because you're passing it a set of parameters. So all these things. So the URL for this web request is going to be URL for assignment.example query 3. Okay. And this URL stuff will look a lot different depending on like um, what sort of backend, like what sort of web framework you're using. This is kind of this is Flask specific. So if you go and do something with MongoDB, Node, or .NET, like MVC, it might look completely different. If we really wanted to, we could put like google.com in here, and it will send us google.com. So we need to specify the data type, because I believe the default data type is HTML, but we're not returning HTML, we're returning JSON. You need to specify that so it knows how to process the data that is returned. And then if the web request is a success, we will run this function. Response is what the web request sends back. And so if we run this function, we will send. Right now, let's just say that like it was a success. And then if it was an error, if it's an error, alert the error. This stuff you don't really need, but I don't know what I include it just to make sure that I can get the error part of this, because I don't think these have default values or not, since it's not a mapping. Okay, so we've made our AJAX request. Now if we do this right now, we're going to get an error that this URL doesn't exist. We can test that really quick. Yep, see, it's already erroring because it's like there is no URL for example query 4. Well, there's also not one for the example query 3, so it's still going to error out. So let's go ahead and add that. So go down here. So we need to specify the route. So at blueprint.route assignment / example query 3. It is a GET request. If you ever are more interested about web development, every web request is like it's either a GET, a POST, a PUT, or there's another one that I don't know right off the top of my head. We're going to name this function example query 3. Keep your naming, whatever you name, like this end, name the function. And then in this, we're going to return nothing. I don't know if that'll error out or not. But let's just see. Okay. We have an error in assignment 58 right now. So let's go back to this index file 58. Oh, okay. So we're missing a comma right here. So we'll just include that comma. There we go. So example query 3, it does error out right now. And it's probably because you can't send back a none type. Yeah. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's just do a query. So instead of saying none, we will return select. We'll call select query, and the query I would like to do, let's think. Let's just grab let's just count all of the rentals. Okay. Let's refresh that. Okay, so it was a success. The web request itself worked. So let's go back and edit what happens when it works. So what we're gonna do, because we're just counting, we're gonna make our columns just it's gonna say count or rentals count. These do not have to be capital. Okay, and then we're going to say create table. We're going to send in the response, which should be that single row in these columns. And so we saved this. So we just come back here and reload the page. Do it again. Okay, cool. So we have 23 rentals in the database, and we can verify that by going back to our database browser. Let's go to the rental. Yep, 23. Cool. So that works. So that is how to do it, kind of from front to end. Once we get kind of more complex, we like creating the views and stuff. We'll have to have different verifications or ways we can just tell the user it was a success, since we don't have to return anything when creating a view. But that's how to do just the basic select queries and like what we have right now. All right, peace.